Hi, welcome back to my channel. This is the first video I'm making since earlier this year, 2020. I decided to take a bit of a break from videos and YouTube for largely due to this year, of course, has been quite tumultuous in many different ways regarding, whether it was mostly because of the pandemic, but also things like riots and all these kinds of things. And oftentimes I felt like the news was changing so rapidly that oftentimes I wasn't really in a position to really be knowledgeable enough to talk about some of the things that were going on. Of course, some people who talked about COVID actually had their videos taken down and removed. So, and even topics that were not of a controversial nature, somehow I felt like it would somehow become an issue. I don't know. But I decided that I'd wait until after the election to continue making videos. And then next year I'll be getting back to a lot of videos on topics within natural sciences and the outdoors and local flora and all that kind of stuff. But today I would like to talk a little bit about the history of presidential election outcomes over the past 130-something years or so, as well as swing states of the past 20 years, and the different types of swing states, the different categories of swing states, why different swing states swung in one direction versus another. Now, this video is not going to get into anything regarding election irregularities or any issues regarding, gerrymandering or possible voting fraud. I'm not getting into any of that kind of thing here. I'm not really getting into politics per se at all in this video, but rather focusing on on changing culture over time that leads to, and with an emphasis on regional cultural values within the U.S., and that's going to be the main focus. Some of these regional cultural variations might come across as generalizations. So again, please understand that I'm not when I talk about different states and different regions, why they may have gone a different way. This is mere speculation, but I think with that we'll get started here. So the links to where I printed these out, I will include in the description. So anyway, here we see this is a map of the U.S. Over the course from 1988 to 1948. Okay, so 60 years total, and with every fourth year, of course, being a year of presidential election. As you can see, from 1988 to 1908. As you can see here, 1908, there are many states, particularly in the West, that are black. And the reason for that is it's not a political party. Those were just territories at the time, okay? And obviously Alaska and Hawaii did not become states with electoral votes, of course, until the 1960 election. Many of the especially in 1988, much of the Northern Rocky states and Northern Plain states were not yet states. And then several of the Southwestern states were also not states until the 1912 election, particularly Arizona and New Mexico being the last states to join the Union as more than just territories. All right, there of course are some other colors on some of these maps that are not Democrat or Republican. Like 1912, you had the Progressive Party. But anyways, let's take a little bit of a look. So a lot of people who might be familiar with the history of both parties are aware that the Democrats up until the 1960s were the party of segregation, Jim Crow, things like that. And the Republicans actually were the side that advocated for the abolition of slavery during the Civil War and beyond. Now, there's a few things to note, though, is that, so people always talk about things like the Great Switch, the Southern strategy of the early 1970s with Richard Nixon. That's very simplistic, though. But we will take a look at that. Again, the history of that. So as you can certainly see, the southeastern states were blue almost consistently through every election, and even well into this map, as you can see here, even well into the 1950s, the southern states were generally solidly Democrat. Until the first year where there was one switch was 1964, but even that was not a permanent switch. So now, again, you can see that with all the changing patterns, the southeastern states, the southern states, really from Texas to Florida and up to Virginia and Kentucky, of course, were blue. The rest of the country were red in 1904, 1908. Now, there was a couple periods within the last 120 years that have been somewhat like a series of landsliding electoral years. And that, of course, included the years of FDR, okay? And then also then again in the 70s and 80s. The years of FDR, you can see that up until 1932, the first election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you can see that it was distinctly red and in the rest of the country except for the southern states from Texas to Florida. Now, why is that? Well, the promises of the New Deal, I think the whole country was largely, economically suffering, and it was pretty, even though he might have been controversial, it was fairly universally popular just among any working class people all over the country. Things like the Work Progress Administration, in the Tennessee Valley Authority, Social Security, just all these different programs were, I think, universally popular. Not universally, but very popular. During this time, the only states that really remained Republican in any of these elections were some of the Great Plains states, as you can see here. So North Dakota through Nebraska, and even in a little Colorado here. And then also some of the northern New England states, which is kind of interesting because those states today are reliably Democrat. And why is this? I don't know enough history, but I imagine that maybe the effects of the Great Depression were not as strong. Of course, you had the Dust Bowl in the 30s, so they were solidly blue. I'm sure there were probably a lot of programs of the New Deal that helped those areas, and therefore FDR was very popular. So anyway, that's basically 1932 through the 1940s. But then after World War II, then the electoral map started to look a little bit more like what it did before FDR, which again saw the southern states being a solid belt of blue and the rest of the country being red. And then in 1960, of course, things started to change just a little bit. The 1960, the rumblings of the civil rights movement probably had something to do with, there was a third party. I think that was the Dixiecrats. Dixiecrat Party was a separate one that I think might have won Mississippi and Alabama during that time. But then 1964 rolled around. That was the election of Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater. It was the first year where, of course, Barry Goldwater was from Arizona, and the southern states were, the Deep South states were against the Civil Rights Act, and Barry Goldwater believed in states' rights. And so that was the first time that the Deep South turned red and the rest of the country was blue. This is well before the Southern strategy, of course. And as we could see later, electoral years, you can see that even then it started to kind of go back to blue, like the election of Jimmy Carter, who was quite progressive, even by the way we would define it today. He was very much for, even at that time, he put like a solar heater on the roof of the White House and more, kind of more of a peacenik, I guess they would call, didn't start any wars. So he was, but he did win, of course, much of the entire South, as well as most of the eastern half of the U.S. The western half of the U.S. in 1976, including, in fact, from 1968 onward up until 1992, was solidly red. Even the entire West Coast, from the early 70s through the late 80s, was red. Now, again, 1968, a very turbulent year. This was when George Wallace was running for president, and this was 4 years after the Civil Rights Civil Rights Act was passed. And then began a period of Republican electoral dominance from Richard Nixon all the way through Reagan, and then up to the election, and then George Bush Sr., okay, who passed away only a couple years ago. Again, why was that? Well, I think that a lot of it, from what I understand, again, not an expert, but that I think that there was a backlash to some of the radical changes of the 60s. Clearly, a lot of the country was like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but the late 60s was more of a turbulent era of massive protests and riots and assassinations, and Nixon came in with a little bit more of a talk of law and order and kind of this return to normalcy, and so Nixon won a 49 state landslide in 1972. Okay. And then Reagan won a 49 state landslide in 1984. Of course, Reagan's emphasis was a little different. He was more on about, deregulating the federal government, and and of course he did not necessarily keep down the military budget, but that's a whole other story. But basically, from throughout the 70s and 80s was an era of Republican dominance. Also, on a side note, Republican dominance by two presidents that have their roots in California, okay, which is interesting because California has been very reliably left-leaning and Democrat in current times. But nonetheless, though, Nixon, of course, was originally from Orange County, and back when it was still like a more agricultural county back earlier in the 20th century. And then, of course, Reagan was governor. So yeah, it is quite interesting to see that. Now, the 90s, even as late as the 90s, the Clinton years, as you can see here in 1992 and 1996 here. Clinton, being a white Southern guy, part of the reason, I suppose, but still nonetheless won a lot of the states in the South. Okay, so the current pattern that we really see today of the last 20 years really only started to arise in 2000, and I'm about to talk about that here very shortly. But yeah, the two elections of the 90s, the two Clinton terms, started to see some of the patterns, like the entire West Coast, the entire Northeast, a lot of the Great Lakes Midwestern states being Democrat were certainly solid there, but still won a lot of southern states. I think at this time there was still a lot of belief that the Democrats were there to listen to the issues of rural poverty, whereas I think by the time that, say, like maybe Obama and later came about, it was sort of either real or perceived. The ideas of rural poverty that might be affecting places like Arkansas, Kentucky, West Virginia, Louisiana, etc. Were, I think, in more current times, it's perceived that the Democrats don't really pay attention to their issues, whereas I think maybe in the Clinton years they still were. Okay, so Clinton years were definitely a bit of a transition between concern for the working classes and poor of rural areas and rural states, but also very much appealing to cultural issues that appealed more to urban areas, especially on issues of like gay rights and much more. So 2000, of course, is the year, and this is what we're going to focus on now, is really the first year where you see the electoral map looking a lot like it does today. In fact, only a handful of states, the majority of the states really were either solidly Republican or Democrat ever since then. Okay, so there's kind of this geographic pattern locked in since 2000, with the exception of just a handful of states, and we're going to talk about those here in a moment. So, since 2000, there have been Basically 15 states. 15 states out of the entirety of the 50. Only 15 that have flipped at some point. Okay, and I'm going to talk about which ones those are here. So Michigan. So again, assuming we know what the results are now, Georgia, the last state they went through their hand recount just like the other day, and it's now solidly for Biden. He won even after that. I know there's still like lawsuits and debates going on, but yeah, it looks like Biden is clearly set as the president-elect. So this is what I have here. So this is including this year as far as the states. So Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania were Democrat every year from 2000 and even before, throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, all the way up until 2016, Trump's first term. And then, of course, went back to blue this year, 2020. So they only went Republican once. They were kind of part of the blue wall of the Rust Belt, again, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So then there's 3 states that basically voted for the winner for like the longest time. So that is since 1996, Florida, Ohio, since 1996 until this year, 2020, Ohio and Florida voted for the winner in every single election. Okay, and so they kind of stand out like that. Iowa is very similar, but Iowa did go blue in 2000, and then, but apart from that, though, it did go along with the winner in every until 2020. This year has gone for the winner every time. So very similar to Florida and Ohio. Then there's 2 states that have been reliably Democrat. So again, Ohio over here, Ohio. So, and then over here, Ohio, Florida, and then Ohio and Florida. Now, again, there's 2 states that have been reliably Democrat except for one election, okay, and that is the one of the Bush terms. New Mexico went red, but since 1992, New Mexico has been solidly blue, which is kind of interesting because New Mexico is a rural state in the West, but has been solidly blue. Again, we'll talk a little bit about why that is. The other state, of course, is New Hampshire. New Hampshire did vote for George W. Bush in 2000. Okay, so, but again, New Hampshire and New Mexico have been blue in all except for one elections in the last 24 years. The opposite, Indiana and North Carolina were solidly red, Republican except for one time, and that was the first election of Barack Obama, who won by somewhat of a landslide, largely a landslide. But yeah, 2008 won North Carolina and Indiana, but those are like one-off. Okay, so the one-off states were New Mexico and New Hampshire, Democrat every year except for one election. Indiana and North Carolina, Republican every year except for one election. And then there's 3 states: Nevada, Virginia, and Colorado. Okay, so those states have been basically were Republican during the George W. Bush era, and have been Democrat since every election since Obama in 2008. Okay. And then this year, of course, you have Arizona and Georgia, which are going Democrat for the first time since the 90s, since the Clinton years. Okay. So since the Clinton years, and of course by fairly narrow margins. So clearly, what we can see, what some of the big conclusions is that there has been a shift of swing states from the Midwest, Great Lakes region to the Southwest and Southeast. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that might be. So again, here's the 2016 map, and here is So again, yeah, Michigan. So the only Midwestern states won were Illinois and Minnesota. And what you can see here is that those states were won back. I know this is the opposite, but and of course I printed this out before North Carolina and Georgia were called for. But Georgia and Arizona, of course, now, again, first time since the 90s that they have gone blue. So now we're going to talk about briefly about why this is. So there has been, like I said, a distinct shift from the Midwest Great Lakes region. Again, I know Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania only won Republican once in 2016, but Ohio seems to be more solidly red. And so Ohio used to be very much the bellwether state, but doesn't seem to be as much now, at least not this year. Even they were considered thinking that Texas might have been a swing state. But yeah, there's clearly a bit of a shift over the since 2000 of swing states being more toward the Southwest and Southeast and less so in the Midwest Great Lakes region. And so let's talk about why that might be. There's 4 reasons I think that, again, minus any like actual political stuff like, gerrymandering or voter irregularities. We're not going to get into that at all. We're talking about cultural shifts or lack thereof. Okay. So a lot of people like to point to 4 possibilities. Okay. One is ethnic demographic changes. People, they point to, one of the reasons why Nevada and Arizona went blue is because of an increasing Hispanic Latino population. Or they say that New Mexico is has been solidly blue for a long time because of that. Well, I kind of have to disagree that is as big of a factor as many people might think. Trump actually won the Hispanic Latino vote, according to the exit polls in 2016 by 29%. And it actually increased, I believe it was 33% this year. In fact, Trump actually overperformed with every demographic group except for white men, which is, again, very ironic, given all the ways that Trump is characterized by the media and so forth. But again, totally different story. But the bottom line is that there actually has been an increase in support. Even Trump in 2016 won a greater percentage of the African American vote and the Hispanic Latino vote than he did in 2012. So even if the percentage of the state's population is increasing, minority population, I think at the same time, minority populations are becoming a little less reliably Democrat. Okay, at least a little bit, enough to suggest that may not play as such an important factor as many people might think. People might ask, well, what about demographic, or what about generational change? Is it true that millennials are more left wing than their parents? Yeah, generally. But our generations may be some more progressive in some ways. But at the same time, as people get older, they also can become more conservative. We've definitely seen this with Generation X, and might be seeing this with millennials, but we'll see. But anyways, I don't really think, again, because people do change over as they get a little older and oftentimes become more conservative, I don't think that's as big of a factor. The third factor that people suggest, is it the case that people from reliably Democrat states with some of the country's largest and most prosperous cities where like the power centers of the country are held in, move to other states, bringing their politics with them and making them turn blue? This is something you often hear a lot of people in Western states complaining about Californians moving in and voting for the same veiled policies. You hear this a lot. This is something I've always been skeptical of. So I live in California, but not from California originally, though. Okay. And from what I have seen, just from my own anecdotal evidence from people who I've spoken with, people who are left-leaning do not want to move to Texas. Like, no one I know. The only people that I know who moved to Texas, either people I know who are famous, like Joe Rogan, for example, or people I know personally, are at the very least politically indifferent or like the lower taxes, or might be flat out more conservative. Now, it is true that I think that the left-leaning Californians that I know do move to states like Oregon and Washington. So the Pacific Northwest does. So I think there's a little bit of like attracts like. Oregon and Washington have been left-leaning for a very long time. It's part of their identity. They may complain about Californians they're moving there too, but that's not really changing the politics there. States like Nevada and Arizona, from what I can tell, attract people that are more libertarian, maybe more economically conservative or fiscally conservative, but maybe more socially liberal. Certainly Nevada, are going to attract people that, like the lower taxes, but also like guns and weed, basically. In Arizona, maybe might get a little bit of both. Colorado, I think, is a state that probably also might attract a little bit of both people that might be across the political spectrum. So I don't really know. I know people who live in those states are going to say, oh, no, you're totally wrong. But again, just from what I can tell, the people that move to the states, they move to those states because they like the existing politics. So I just don't know if, again, it may be a factor. I'm not saying it's not a factor. I'm just saying it may not be the primary factor. Then there's the fourth reason. The parties have shifted a little bit. What were the issues during, say, like the George W. Bush years? The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was, for whatever hate or complaints about Trump, I think we can say that Trump is far less hawkish than George W. Bush, and he's often regarded as like the first president since Carter that hasn't really got the U.S. involved in any new wars. So if being anti-war is your thing, then you're probably going to dislike Trump less than George W. Bush. So what were those states that won George W. Bush the 2 terms in a row? Virginia, Nevada, and Colorado. Colorado and Virginia are known for having a lot of military bases. Virginia is the center of the Navy. Colorado, of course, has a lot of companies there that make military hardware and have many military bases around Colorado Springs. So if you're connected some ways to what they call the military-industrial complex, then those states that probably had a higher percentage would have been more likely to vote for George W. Bush. However, things have changed a little bit. So what used to be a more left-leaning and Democrat concern about the effects of globalization and fair trade, Trump kind of basically co-opted that, as during the Obama years, those issues were kind of like forgotten and abandoned. And so this is plays an obvious factor as to why Trump won Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania in 2016. And of course, Trump also, talked a lot more about issues of law and order, whereas that wasn't really an issue in the 2000s. So again, the issues during the 2000s, during the George W. Bush era, was the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Republicans were more free trade and globalized economy, and there was also much heavier evangelical, that was pushing back against increase in gay and LGBT rights and things like that. Those issues are not really an issue with the Trump era. So as much. Again, Trump has pulled back from military intervention. The issue of gay marriage has been settled, and so some of those social things not as much of an issue. But what has become an issue is getting factories back from overseas, from China, that kind of thing. And again, whether you want to say whether they're actually doing anything about it, that's not the issue here. The issue is just simply, what are the issues? And those issues about free trade, globalized economy, factories moving overseas is a much bigger concern, has long been a much bigger concern in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio. Okay. Whereas those area issues were not so much of an issue in Virginia and Colorado. Now, Virginia and Colorado, again, in addition to having a lot of military bases, also has a very highly educated population who have jobs that are less affected by globalization, probably jobs in things like maybe tech-related, government-related, that were not as impacted by the Great Recession from 2008 to 2012 and recovered better. So, and also, again, the South and the West, from a cultural perspective, probably I think have a little bit more evangelical population. Colorado Springs is certainly known for that. They had like a lot of like groups headquartered there that were like really all about family, like hardcore family values. In the Midwest, in the Great Lakes states, you probably have a lot higher percentage of Catholics than evangelicals. Why does that matter? I was raised Catholic. I still am Catholic, but for the most part, Catholics kind of have a very much of a separation of church and state. They really, more often than not, now again, there is a lot of exceptions, so this is a kind of a generalization, but Catholics by and large generally don't, kind of leave their church out of the politics. In fact, the church often then is more of a community and family thing rather than, it's not part of the Bible Belt, those states. Again, kind of a generalization, but so because of that, issues of like gay marriage probably would back in, again, 20 years ago, that was a big issue. Marriage equality did not become something universally or relatively universally accepted until only less than 10 years ago. It happened in 2015 nationwide. So that also plays a bit of a role. So George W. Bush was the era where the Republicans were all about free trade and global trade, military intervention, and evangelicals that were had more of an issue with things like LGBT rights. In the Trump era, Trump's personality is obviously a lot more, abrasive and dislikable by many people. Again, I'm kind of thinking that, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan, again, is more working class. I think that people had less of an issue with his mannerisms, but really cared about the manufacturing coming back. So again, of course, it wasn't a big surprise that he won those states in 2016. Now, what about this year? Okay, so again, Arizona and Georgia going blue for the first time. The big divide, of course, now is urban versus rural. When you're looking at the patterns of Republicans versus Democrats. That wasn't a case even as late as the 90s. Again, Bill Clinton won many rural southern states, West Virginia, Louisiana, Arkansas, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, and those states have long gone solidly Republican. Meanwhile, Arizona and Georgia do have urban centers that are quite cosmopolitan and have a diverse white-collared workforce in places like Atlanta and Phoenix, respectively. And so, so again, some of those other factors, demographic change, generational change, people from urban centers moving to nearby rural states. Again, it plays a factor. I'm sure it plays a factor in Vermont's politics. Obviously, you had Bernie Sanders has long been a politician in Vermont, first as mayor of Burlington, Vermont, then governor or senator. That even though he's originally from Brooklyn. So again, those other three factors do play a role, but I think again, there's a big shift from the evangelical, military and global trade to kind of the rough and tough, abrasive, guy who tries to appeal to more of the working class, and then talks about getting factories back, and not so much of an issue with like gay rights or anything like that. So that's my analysis. You can agree or disagree with me, but hopefully you did find that interesting. That look at a little bit of the history of presidential elections. And with that, I hope to see you again. Again, if you like this video, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. I'm going to be doing a couple videos coming up. One on a sort of a summary of public lands across the country, and I'm also going to do some music reviews as well. So, but anyways, with that, have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.